Works for me.
Awesome. Well, welcome. Super excited for this conversation today with Julie. It's going to be such a good one. I already know it because even the last conversation we had and our little preamble, there's just so many little nuggets that I know we're going to get into today. So we'll talk about Integrate, we'll talk about your podcast, and what we're really going to dive into today is what this concept of safe spaces means, because I think it's becoming such a word right now. And a lot of people are talking about it, but let's talk about how to actually implement it. But to start, tell me about you. Who are you? What is the work that you do? And how did you get to this point of bringing a podcast forward and actually talking about things like safe spaces and trauma and healing in that capacity? Tell me everything.
Yeah. All right. So, okay. So my name is Julie Johnson. I am I'm the co-founder of Integrate. Some people might be familiar with the girl the human, sorry, they, pronouns are now they, Victoria.
Mm-hmm.
And they have a Victoria manual on Integrate, and they also are on Instagram, and they also helped co-wrote the book on Being Your Body, which a lot of people are aware of. So I always try to give them credit whenever I introduce, because while they're out doing promotional things, they're also created a big part in the space and the tone as well, even though I'm kind of curating it right now and playing a pretty big part in it. But so yay, Victoria, for co-founding with me. So Victoria and I founded Integrate. We're both survivors of trauma. So, and we both have histories of that. So I, right off the bat, like there's our connection to it. I also work in Ferguson, Missouri. This is the spaces part for me. This is where the spaces become pretty significant to me. So, I work in Ferguson, Missouri, famously known for the death of Michael Brown in the school systems there. I'm a special educator, and I guess it's called an accessibility specialist. Sorry, an accessibility specialist is my actual job title. So I do assistive technology and access, and I kind of work with general education teachers on how to make the curriculum modified and accommodating to students with all kinds of learning barriers and visual impairments, things like that. So, and I work through the scope of universal design. And then I also run, with Natasha Babler, I also run a yoga program in that school system as well, that helps kind of teach relationship building skills because of the amount of not safe spaces that there are. So that impacts relationships. So we kind of helped, Natasha and I kind of helped build a program there. And then where Integrate came from in that, connecting the dots, I wish I could tell you it was just we just had such a vision now. Integrate was happening while this was happening, and we were trying to figure out how all of these work together, and they did. At one point in time, Integrate was a Facebook group to help connect the dots to trauma sensitive providers for the program in the school. So that's how it started.
Yeah.
And then they became two separate things, and people were like, and Victoria moved to Oakland, and it became like this international networking thing, and that became Integrate. This like Facebook group called the St. Louis Trauma Informed Network became Integrate, became like a whole side business I wasn't even thinking I was going to have ever. And I think that's why Integrate has taken so long to have things, because it took me a little while to accept that. To own the bigness of it took me a hot second to try to understand what was going on, because I didn't understand what was going on for a long time. And I just kept doing things like, I don't understand why people keep coming over here. And so I'm just trying to make my job a little easier to do. Like, that's all I want, is make my job a little easier. And I don't know what all this stuff is going on. And like, that was the mystery of Integrate for a long time. And Victoria, so became like a place for trauma sensitive providers to then like sort of promote their own work. And that's what it became. And so it started out as a St. Louis space in Missouri. So St. Louis, for those that are not familiar with the flyover states, United States, that's where I live. I'm 4 hours from Chicago. Like, that's for those that don't know where I am. They're like somewhere in the middle, and I'm like 4 hours from Chicago. That's where I'm at. Yeah. And so that's where I'm located. And from an international standpoint, whenever I travel internationally, I'm like 4 hours from Chicago. They're like, oh, okay,
that one.
That's where I'm at. Not that one. I'm like, that one, right in the middle there. So yeah, so I'm like right on the Illinois border, in St. Louis, like right between in Missouri, but like right on the Illinois border, 4 hours from Chicago. So yeah, so we were kind of just connecting providers here, but then Victoria moved out. We were like, okay, we could do this nationally. How would that look? And then it kind of exploded from there. That was 2017, 16, 17 is kind of when that exploded. And then we were like, well, how do we connect these dots? Like, what are we doing? Like, what are we actually doing here? Like, what am I doing in the school system? And then what am I doing in these yoga spaces? And then what am I doing here? And because I'm also a yin yoga teacher, and like we were trying to connect all these different dots, like, and it became down to like, we're actually with a lot of, I'm actually like making this like the Cliff's Notes of the Cliff's Notes in the United States. That means like, I don't know if you all have that in New Zealand, but it's like the super summarized version is what I'm saying. So, super summarized version is like, what are we actually doing in all of these places? What are you trying to figure out? What's the inquiry? And we were trying to figure out safety. What does safety mean in the school system? What does safety mean in the yoga space? What does safety mean in the world, right? From a world of, because like really what is trauma sensitivity really is like, it's really, that's all we're asking is like, how do we create human safety? How do we make humans feel held and supported relationally, systematically, like neurobiologically, right? That's actually what we're doing. We just take it into all these different layers and integrate.
Yeah, I love that. I love that it's like that intersection point where all of these places can kind of come together and people can find what they need in that and find the resources or the modality, the practitioner, whatever that looks like. So have you curated a kind of baseline or outline for what a safe space is? Like when you're trying to connect all of these dots, what's that umbrella term of a safe space? Like what's that benchmark?
So that, if we're talking on the macro level, we're looking at universal design, which I know you and I have talked about in our last thing, so that's like universal design. So, I'm looking at it. Victoria and I have always, and Natasha, Natasha, those three are kind of my main three people that have helped kind of formulate the things, Yeah. So Victoria really helped formulate, integrate, and then Natasha kind of really helped formulate what's going on in the school system, right? And then, so those are my main three people that have supported this. But like, so on like the individual level, right, we're talking about the window of like the polyvagal theory, I guess I'll call it that. I call it because, yeah, so the individual level, but then like what does that polyvagal theory look like? What's the name for that when we put it on the macro level? And we have all these different people coming together, and that's what we call universal design, right? And that's like kind of looking at how can we look at what's the purpose of whatever the need, the community need is right now. Who needs to be talking? And sometimes it's not what we want, it's just like what we need, right? Who needs to be talking? And not only whose voice can be received, okay, that's the question, can be received is also the one that needs to be talking by the audience so we can get the community needs met. Does that make sense? And meet these solutions and problems. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So if you were to say that on I guess more of like a systemic level, or even just on an organizational level, if somebody listening runs let's say a yoga studio, or they're a teacher themselves, they're like whatever they do in a work capacity, how are they going to start defining a safe space for them and the people that they interact with? What does that look like? And why is it important? Why do they need to make their spaces safer?
Right. So safety is a spectrum. This is just one of I'm getting my chart that I created on Integrate. There it is. Okay. It's my chart that has all of my notes on these things on there. So I think we have to understand that a safe space, we cannot define a safe space, like that's not up to us to define. But we can create an inquiry around how we can make it safe-ish, because it's a spectrum. So I always call it safety-ish. People always laugh when I say that, because I'm like, it's an ish, right? Like there are like 1,000 reasons why something can't be safe. And that's your point, isn't to go, because you can't control someone else's sense of safety. Like no one else can control my sense of safety. But I can look at things, I can have these frameworks to help me guide my decision making in what that looks like on when in the community and in a space. So is that kind of what is that what you're talking about? What is that guidepost?
Yeah.
Is that what you're asking? Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's my spiel on safety. Is it's like a safe space is it safety-ish?
Yeah.
It's like safe-ish.
Yeah.
Safe-ish space, right? Because that's not up to us to determine. Well, we can like create a safe-ish space, knowing that we don't have full call over that, and that's someone else's determination to make, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the four things we look at, like on a regardless of the space, from like the spectrum of universal design, is representation. Okay, so again, that's who is like, sorry, I'm looking at my my notes on my phone. So where my brain is. So like that's, you know, who needs to be at the microphone, you know, what humans need to be in the leadership, in helping promote whatever it is, talking about the need, you know, who needs to be there. So that's representation, right? Staff culture, you know, or just culture. I just say staff culture because like a lot of this stuff is school based, but like just the culture of in the space that you're holding. Podcasts have a culture, right? Like every place has a culture, you know. So what's the culture of the space that you have? What are you trying to build? What are you trying to be known for, right? Like, do we reinforce mirroring so people feel heard, right? So like, what's the culture we're trying to build, you know, among this group of people? Communication and engagement. So I can break down more of those in each one, but representation I know is big. So
yeah, really big, really, really big. And I think that's probably the biggest thing that we're seeing blow up right now is this conversation around representation, because for so long we've been kind of making these unilateral decisions from this white male patriarchal standpoint, and then everyone else is like, yeah, I guess we'll just go along with that, even though I'm not represented in this conversation at all whatsoever. And then there's all those intersections of what's being represented. So I think within that, that's exactly where we can't speak to what's going to be safe for anyone else. All we can do is take precautions and think about it in as compassionate and empathetic way as we can, and put certain things into place so that it is that safe-ish space. And we're like, hopefully I am doing the best I can. And then we listen to feedback. When people come and say, actually, XYZ didn't work for me, then we can take that on. Or if we don't have the capacity to, then we can leave it. But I think that representation is huge. And I really want to highlight something that you said the last time we spoke, because it's stuck with me up until now. I think it's Natasha that said it, but it's nothing about us without us.
Yeah, and that's a disability. That's a disability rights like statement. There's no author in it. She just said it on our podcast, so I always am like, she referenced it, and it's like a disability thing, like statement that's often said. Yeah.
I think everyone needs to hear that, because it's that's happening so often. Like so often these conversations are being had about, okay, how do we make this space inclusive and safe for everyone, but no one else is represented in that space. It's all a bunch of whatever that one group identifies as, and then trying to make that accessible for others. So how do we authentically invite other people into the conversation? Like rather than forcing it.
So you mean into the conversation of safety? Is that what you mean? Like once
inclusivity and safety, really? Because if we're talking about representation, like let's say the yoga studio, for example, if we look around our yoga studio and we think, wow, it is all white, predominantly females that come into this yoga space. How is it then that we are authentically allowing it to be a more inclusive space. Because I think there's a lot of like cultural appropriation right now where we're trying to like look like we're doing a good job, and we're trying to look anti-racist, and we're trying to look like we're safe and inclusive. But a lot of it's done in a pretty inauthentic way, and it's a lot for show
Right.
from what I've seen. So what would you say
Right.
is that first step that someone can take if they're authentically trying to make their space more inclusive and open to the possibility? Because we can't force anyone to come into our space and be like,
Right.
come in here. What is
Well, it's interesting because that's what I'm doing. That's one of the things I'm doing in the yoga studio I teach at right now, called Joy of Yoga. Is one of the things we're doing is like, and I remember talking to you about this in our last thing, in our last conversation, is we are currently looking at, okay, we're in a white neighborhood, and the acupuncture studio that's next door, Golden Door, is also doing the same thing. We're kind of actively doing it together. We're kind of actively asking these questions together, which is great. And so great to like do it like as a community and do it authentically. Is we're like, okay, how do we, so we're in a white neighborhood, and we do have people of color that do come to our, in our studio. We have we have a couple of people from that are Black, Indigenous people of color that teach and go to, come in there, but the mostly are white, neighborhood, pretty affluent. And how do we work with that and keep it authentic, and for in the city we're in, the way that we've addressed it is like St. Louis is like a really big like small business city. Like we love to support artists. We love to support small businesses. Like this is like probably the like glue that's holding us together during COVID right now, is our community's love for small business. So like one thing we've done between Golden Door and Joy of Yoga is we have put together like supporting Black artists. Like Golden Door has a lot of like Black artists from St. Louis that they buy their stuff and they amplify it, on their social media. And like that works, right? We're not trying to force, we're not in a place that where they're, we're not going to go gentrify and open up, in Black spaces either, because that's kind of not okay either. You know what I mean? Like there's a whole issue. So it's like, it is, you have to be really through through universal design, we were like, okay, that's not our aim either, is to go take property away from the neighborhood either. So what can we do? Well, we love small business. We want to help amplify it. We have some extra funding. So like, let's amplify this creative work. And, the people in this neighborhood love to support it. They're pretty, we're in a pretty progressive area, so people love to support, and empower, as I say, empower Black and, Indigenous people of color businesses. So that's kind of how we have started to kind of do that. And we're starting to put together like giveaways, on there, so we can amplify that and begin to do it. That's one way we did it. Another route we're doing, at least at Joy of Yoga, is we're starting to do like a mindful of race stuff or group recordings around the book by Ruth. I'm doing it right now. I'm like, Ruth King. There we go. Ruth King, around mindful of race. So that's another way we're kind of doing it through like the empowering way, and then I'll call it also the shadowy way, right? So you have to kind of do both. We kind of think there's a shadow work we have to do around that. And then there's a way we can do that's empowering and kind of life-giving, that's kind of resilient. So that's kind of the two ways that we do it. And that sets a tone then culturally, because now we're going into culture, where we can create a space for belonging, around the path to belonging, is what I say, for the people that are coming into the spaces that are yoga students or yoga teachers. We're creating a space where people know where we stand. We know where we're headed. We're very in our marketing and what we're doing, kind of where we're headed. And that's kind of like what it's not perfect, and we're still very new at the process of it, doing it collectively, but people know where we stand, and we know that, like we don't attract a lot of people that love that, like that would, they would bring racist flags into a studio, you know, like we don't attract those people, you know, and that's by design, right? We don't want to attract white folks that aren't, you know, that don't want that either. So that's where that belonging piece also is, because if you do that on a macro level, you know, collectively as a culture, as an organization, you're going to set a tone for what people think about, you know, what people know is acceptable and not acceptable, right? In terms of behavior. And so.
And I love that aspect of leading by example, because it is that shadow work that you spoke to, I think is such an important aspect of this, because in order to highlight all of the non-safety and unsupportive spaces that we're seeing and re-traumatizing spaces for a lot, it comes down to that personal responsibility of like, am I looking at my own unconscious bias? Am I looking at my own subtle ways that maybe I don't even realize the unsafe spaces that I create, or the unsafe interactions that I have, or the businesses that I do support, or whatever it looks like? There has to be that moment of deep self-reflection of where am I putting my money? What are my words saying? What am I creating? Like, not only what community culture am I creating, but on an individual level, who do I show up as? And I think that self-reflection is huge.
Yeah, and I think that's something I love about Ruth. Have you read Ruth King's book?
Not yet.
Mindful of Race?
No, I've ordered it.
I think you would really like it. Just like this is the second time I've done like a reflection process like this. Right now we're a little bit low in attendance because people are just really traumatized right now in the United States because of COVID. So we just are recording it as like a on demand like thing that people can do later. Because I was like, let's just do that, and which is another UDL thing. You know, we're like, hey, this is important all the time, but people don't have access right now, so we're gonna do it later. So we went ahead and recorded it, and we're like, we're gonna put it out as a studio, you know, later on our free Black Lives Matter website, you know. And so one thing that I love about that is she is able to do it in a way that I think is really innately. I mean, there's some things in the book where I'm like, but towards the end, but like in terms of safety, that I don't know how I feel about it yet, but one thing that I love that she does is she blends in, like, she looks at like relative reality, you know, like who are the roles in my body, in the body, in my skin, then the ultimate reality. And so she makes it hard, and you have to hold both. Yeah. And you know, and it makes it hard to spiritually bypass through that. So she's like, and I love that she brings it up all the time, you know, and she just lays out a really, really great, I don't know, not a case, but a really great narrative around mindfulness and how to be mindful and become an empathic witness to yourself while you become an empathic witness to others. And it's myself and the community constantly in the book. And I just love how she's able to bridge those two together, because that mirrors kind of like what we're doing with Integrate too, right?
Wow, I really love that. Yeah, I've ordered it, but things are taking their sweet time to get places right now.
Yeah,
over here. We will get it at some point. Amazing. And I love that it just stays in conversation. Like, it stays in that space of, we're never going to be perfect at this. We're never going to nail it and be like, yep, done. We understand how to do all of these things, because this is unprecedented. Like, we are in a time that globalization is huge. This interconnectedness that we're feeling is huge. We are living through a pandemic, like unprecedented. And we're having these conversations now. We're unpacking systemic racism and collective trauma on such deep levels. And I think for me, what I notice is that staying in inquiry and staying curious, I think, is the biggest way that I've noticed that safe spaces can actually be created, because we'll never know the actual answer. But if I get set in my ways and I'm like, no, this is the framework for a safe space, then I'm still excluding so many people. Whereas if I stay in curiosity and I say, what works for you? What do you need in this moment? We can actually start to have those deeper conversations around what is the spectrum of safety? what is unsafe for the majority of people, what is safe in certain aspects and areas. And I think the other big question that I think I have around all of this is, how would you broach the conversation? So say you're working in an organization, or you're in an office, you're somewhere that you're working, and you know, like your gut is telling you this is unsafe. There's so many systems in place that are unsafe, that are just perpetuating everything we don't want to be perpetuating right now. How does somebody kind of like steel themselves and prepare themselves to have that conversation with a boss or a colleague? Or what steps can they take to start inviting in more safety or more conversation around it?
Well, I think the question is, and this is why Integrate has done in the school system has done so well, is because my boss and I have had those conversations in the school system,
Yeah.
and she's awesome and open. But if your boss is not open, like, it's not going to work. Like, I mean, I just want to be really honest. Like, your administration, your leaders have to be on board with you, right? In
Yeah.
order to, if they aren't, if there's if there's no understanding or no will to move forward, then it's a no-go. You know what I mean? It won't go forward. I've worked in organizations where that was the case, and I quit. You know, so I mean, like, that's what ended up happening. The safest thing I could do was quit. So
Yeah.
like, I quit. You know, and I mean, I've worked, you know, in the not-for-profit industry in St. Louis, or in the, you know, actually all over United States over, you know, 14 years, you know, and I've worked in really unsafe organizations, unsafe for me emotionally, because if it's unsafe in the culture, it's probably not safe for me, right?
Yeah.
So like, there's that level. And then if it's not safe for me, someone who's white and female, who else isn't it safe for? And then, do I need to be wasting my time here? I do mean that, you know, and those are the questions you have to ask when you're working, especially in the nonprofit organization and in the school system too. And you know, which, like, whatever, you know, that's a whole different conversation. But like, specifically, and I know there's a lot of people that listen that are like social workers and do a lot of social justice stuff. So that's why I'm sticking to NGOs and nonprofits. But like, there's can be a lot of not safe things that happen, you know, and I think you have to have leaders in those organizations that are, you already know from the time you're hired that you're going to go forward, because if they're not down for the cause from the time you are there, it's not going to go forward. You know, you're just, you know, I mean, it just won't. I mean, you can't play God, right? So that's kind of the thing. So I'm like, if you're looking, like, anyone that's in college looking for a job, like, know the markers, right? If you start to see the red flags, like, run far, far away, like, go, because there are plenty. Here's the cool thing about right now, especially in the States, not everywhere, but especially in the States, especially in St. Louis and Chicago, is right now there lots of organizations want to start to ask these questions, right? And thank goodness to Black Lives Matter and, you know, their movement after George Floyd, is that it forced like white companies to have to address it, and it's still happening today, to the point that they cannot turn away. In fact, you're actually kind of given a little bit of a side eye if you don't say Black Lives Matter. You're kind of socially shamed. And I was like, great, good, like, keep that up, you know. So I know there's lots of opinions about that, but that's kind of where the mainstream is right now in like progressive areas. So and that's a good thing. So I think that it's less so than it was even before George Floyd. You know, I think George Floyd, definitely in St. Louis, Michael Brown like pushed everyone there, but I think nationally, even globally, it pushed everyone there a little bit more so, right?
Yeah.
So does that make sense?
Yeah. It's more so just that area of, I talk to so many people who they're like, I just know that we can be doing better. I know that we can be making these changes. And if we continue to leave these jobs without having these conversations, are we doing a service to these people by not saying anything? Because
no, you can say no, you can say something, you just don't have to stay. That's what I'm saying. Like, you don't have, like, I know a lot of people that would be like, you know what I mean, that would just be like, oh, you know, I'll just stick around and I'll try to make the change, you know. That, you know, that I've been that person in a lot of my jobs, you know, and I've tried to do that, and And that was just, but yeah, no, I think the conversations have to happen, and that's going to tell you if you're safe. Like, that's going to be the clincher. If we can't have the conversations, no safety, right? Like, we can't.
What would you say if somebody is in leadership themselves and they're just starting this journey of, I guess, discovering safety and hearing these words, and they're like, oh my gosh, I don't even know where to start. Like, I know that I want to create a culture that's supportive, inclusive, safe, and accessible, but I have no idea. Like, yes, they're living into it themselves personally, but what would you say is the top 3 things that they could do to kind of get their foot over the line and get that momentum building and going? What can they do in that space?
The question is I always ask, look at the people around. What's the purpose? What's your purpose? I don't think Natasha and I covered this in our, so this is important. I was like, who is the most vulnerable in the room, in the space? How can I reach the most vulnerable? Okay. And who needs to say it? But I think, because this is universal design, because if you can make the most vulnerable, I get arguments about this, but I have not seen it to be true at all. If you can reach the needs of the most vulnerable, you can reach the needs of a good chunk of everyone else too. Hands down. Like, that's UDL. I mean, seriously, let's look at COVID. United States is a failing example. So let's just take that. So if we had just reached the needs of the marginalized and immunocompromised from the beginning, it would have saved us all. Okay. It would have saved thousands of lives if we had just told everyone to wear a mask, by the way. Okay. And we would be, by protecting them, by being like, oh, they're the most compromised, they're the ones that could die, we need to save their lives. And then guess what? In the saving of their lives, we would have saved everybody else. That's UDL right there, that we failed at miserably. But it's the same thing. You look at it, take that same, always give what's whoever's the most vulnerable in the room, give those needs first, and everyone, and it'll be a ripple effect, right? Because like in a a classroom, I know yoga, I get from a lot of yoga teachers, whenever I say this, I get a lot of pushback, but I'm like, no, not true. Like, if you have someone that has like whatever, needs a lot of modifications, right? Like, through giving choices, or you can say, even if you don't need to do that modification, you should still do that and see what happens. You just gave that person like probably a new embodied experience for themselves, right? Like, nobody loses when you give the most vulnerable in the room, in the space, in the community. Like, when you start to address those needs, everybody's needs start to get, it's amazing how that happens, right? It does not fail. It's like a fail safe. And nothing is fail safe, but it's almost there. I'd say it's 95%. Like, if you do that, you will save and you will help everyone else in different ways, but just by going to the most vulnerable in the room.
Yeah, and I think that's where I get so sad for these like developed countries that have shifted to, because the reason that we're so developed in that way is because we've shifted to this individualistic society away from collectivism. And when we look at the collectivism and that collective mindset, those are the ones that are doing the best. Those are the ones that are the most advanced or handling this situation currently the best. And I think that's where I'm like, if we could just come back to, we are all in this together. If they fail, if they are harmed, either immediately or down the track, I am also harmed. So we have to forget this whole every man for themselves, every person for themselves, every woman, person, animal, all of it. Like, we're so divided in every aspect. And if we can come back to, we're all in this together and I need to take care of everyone on every level. Like, there's a reason that even if you look at the animal kingdom, when you look at wolves, the alpha goes to the back of the pack, and the alpha is they're the last person, because they know that the oldest, the weakest, all of that, like, you are as strong as your weakest link. Yes. So if we could come back to our more animal instincts and realize that we are that collective, I think that's what would make the most massive difference. And I think that's what a safe space is. If you're in it for
Yeah.
yourself, you know that it's not a safe space.
Right.
Period.
And you can tell, you can tell if you're with a therapist that's not helpful, you can tell, that's in it, you can tell. I can tell just by the words people say. I was like, oh, I should probably leave this yoga space. This person just said 12 different things that, whatever, luckily I'm doing things mostly on Zoom, so I can leave and turn things off whenever. But like, but I mean, you can tell in that space, because then it's like, well, it's about what I want and not really about what other people want. And I think, that's where universal design helps us come out of some of, kind of come into that. It kind of looks at the whole framework and it's like, okay, if the need that I am seeing and the need that involves probably my needs too, if we begin to sparse out, who's the most impacted, then then everyone will be reached. Nobody is getting a handout, because everyone's impacted, right? Because that's what I love about universal design. Everyone's impacted. There's not one person in COVID that's not impacted, right? But like we forget about that, I think, as white folks, and that's like our own work we have to do around that. We actually have bodies in a race and we impact people, shockingly. And so we have an ethnicity. We do, like, and like we have an ethnicity. We have like a, we have a whole European history that we sometimes disassociate that's even race, so I think we forget that that's our culture. And so America has been, we forget that, like, what's our culture? Like Danish, Irish, that's a lot of our culture, right? And so so I think we need to go back and go look at our own culture too. We got to go back and I did this work in Zaretta Hammond's the Culturally Responsive Teachers workshop this summer, where she had white folks go back and like reclaim their heritage, right? And in that reclaiming of their heritage, we were actually able to like tap into collective thinking a little bit, and not in the way of like we all have trauma, like, but like in like, oh yeah, like, like that's a part of my culture, and that's a part of my culture, and not even the culture of like our European ancestors, but like how that culture of like, I have an Irish, German, Danish background, right? How that impacted, the culture of my family, right? And I think that, and we don't have to appropriate. We just need to kind of go backward a little bit and reclaim a little bit of our own European ancestry. And that also means owning the oppression too. But when we go back to that, we have to realize we've been conditioned to not do that over time. And I think that's really a powerful way that we can step out of individualism and go back to the collective we came from.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love that. I think collectivism is just, it's everything. It's what we came from. It's how we got here. Like, we got here,
right,
surviving through all of these things and that evolutionary way. So it's sad to me that we've gone so far towards the individualistic side of things. But I have one more question for you.
Yeah.
And I'm interested to see if it's going to be anything like what you said last time. Maybe yes, maybe no, who knows? But think about locally, globally, whatever. And on that scale, is there one big change that you would want to see made, or one massive norm or societal norm that you would want to see disrupted, and why?
I think it changes all the time for me. Depending on the day. Let's see here. The disruption. Today, I think for me, I think that, I'm still at, nothing about us without us. I think that was my question last time, right? Wasn't that my statement? Yeah, I was like, I think that was, yeah, that hasn't changed. I'm like, because I think that's like the number one issue I have is like, in general, with like spaces, with anything, is like when people start speaking for others that aren't in the space, right? Like, and we're not bringing that into the conversation. We're we start to like, with abortion in the United States, men make a lot of laws for women's bodies, in the States. And so, yeah, like there's no women in the room, like talk about a global nothing about us without us situation that I know a lot of like North American and European and, and Australia and New Zealand people could tell you, like, there's probably a relating to that, like that's like another one, where I just think that, and you can take that to every level, but I think that when you start to state it as a question and a statement, nothing about us without us. Well, who's missing from the room, right? Who needs to be at the table, as we discern and kind of deal with messiness in organizations, yoga studios, schools, right? Nothing about us without us. So it's a statement and a question, right? And it can stem into like, who needs to be here? And it could go through that, representation, culture building, communication and engagement aspects of how to create socially, intersectional belonging is what we call it in integrate now, aka universal design. It's just the sexy language behind it. It's really funny because like for the longest time, whenever we would say universal design, people would be like, I don't know what you mean. But then as soon as we start calling it intersectional belonging, people are like, what is that? And I was like, I'm like, really good marketing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
I'm speaking to my people, that's all that is. I was like, it's just a way of saying universal design, because whenever I start saying universal design, people kind of check out. So when I start saying like intersectional belonging or social emotional inclusion, I get more.
Yeah. Oh, I know
I get
the
more
words. Yeah.
Yes. So same thing, just a different, just sexy language.
Classic. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so good. I love that. And I'm glad that is still so prevalent, because that was one of my biggest takeaways the last time we talked, was hearing that, because it's just such a succinct way to highlight what all of our issues are about right now. If we look at every single issue that we're having on every single level, that's what it comes down to. Like when we think about land that we're taking away for infrastructure, well, we're not talking to the indigenous people that walk on that land. So we're deciding for them, you don't need this land, we're going to take it. And when we think about the abortion, don't even get me started, I could go on for days.
Right.
Like stuff like that. It's just like, why are we not talking about this? And then I think that's where this whole idea of safe spaces comes back to, is I've seen so many, and like you and I right now, like we're talking about safe spaces and inclusion as two white females.
Right.
Two of us having this conversation. So even within that, there has to be that mindfulness around, who else am I talking to? Who else am I having this conversation with? Who's not being heard? Whose voice needs to be at the table? So I love that. I think it's such a poignant reminder. And it's something that I've said to myself probably every day since you told it to me. I'm like, okay, keep that in the back of your head. I love it.
Yeah, it's constantly in the back of my head. It's how integrate operates, it's how it's always operated. It's always been the question, for us, like who needs to be at the table, who needs to be, and I think that it just is kind of a good, reminder to, as far as safety, that, remember, safety is a spectrum, right? And the one thing we can do to create at least one little bit of making it a little bit safer is bringing someone that can understand it. And that can mean anything. It doesn't always, representation, of course, by minorities is also helpful and necessary, by all means, right?
Yeah.
But it can mean like safety, like someone, like I don't really, like from like a trauma sensitive angle, because I do have a history of trauma, like I don't always like want to like talk to someone that doesn't understand trauma sensitivity around stuff. Like that's not safe for me, right? Little things like that, can be like, I'm not going to go to a therapist that doesn't understand a trauma informed lens on these things, right? Like it goes that it can be that interpersonal and that systemic, right? Nothing about us without us. Well, I don't want to go someone that doesn't, understand some of my experiences, as a therapist, things like that, right? And I think that I just wanted to take it into that micro level understanding too, because I think that that's prevalent. Because I know there's a lot of people that go to therapists, because that's why a lot of people end up finding integrators. Like, I went to a therapist, they victim shamed me. I struggle with addiction, and I had, I had a therapist who like started doing a lot of the, victim blaming on me with that. And like, yeah, not safe. Like, that's someone that doesn't understand the trauma and addiction piece, right?
Yeah.
So I think that it can go that personal, or it could get wide, depending on what the need is and, whose needs need to be met, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time, and thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for sticking with it even when you didn't know that this is what you were creating. I think that's so great, because we need more of these platforms that do connect the dots, and a lot of the time we don't even understand what it is that we need or what we're looking for. So to know that there is those platforms that are bringing it all together and having these conversations, I think is so important. So I really appreciate you. I appreciate your work, and I appreciate this conversation. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I think the big thing is, in terms of integrate, I think what sets us apart than maybe from other platforms is, we're looking at it from an inquiry, not like, we're not coming at it like we are not overzealotry in our we're like, hey, I've been figuring it out since 2000. I mean, I've been like on the path since 2012. So like, whatever, it's constantly revolving. I have rebranded integrate, I think 6 times. So I mean, like, whatever, so, so it's an inquiry and it changes, and, like, we're here for it, man. We're here for it. So
I love it. I love it so
yeah.
much. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Amanda. I appreciate it.